Today we're joined by Hugo Valentin. He's based out of Puerto Rico, and he's been a MovMed coach for almost a year now, coming up on a year. And he's been helping us run some of the 5 for 5 classes and our membership classes before. He's also an oxygen advantage instructor. I'm excited to to discuss the breathwork side of things and how you've kind of been melding those approaches a little bit. But yeah, thanks for coming on, man. I know we've talked a bit before about you've had quite the health journey, and have been in a pretty rough spot for a long time, and it seems like you're definitely on the up and up. Was there kind of like a genesis? Was there when did things kind of take a turn for the worse? Was it pretty early on? And it'd be kind of cool to just like hear your story and how you've got to where you are now.
For sure, yeah. Thanks for having me on, guys. I would say the genesis of my trajectory to get here to where I am with you guys now was really pretty early on in my life. I was pretty active. I would dip my toe in a bunch of different sports, both by way of my family and also by my own desire. And eventually I got into tennis relatively competitively. But then by the age of 12, I quit. And I just fell into a major depression, just absolute depression. Um, got into video games and I just kind of got sucked in a hole and I stayed there all the way till college, I would say, late college. And that took different forms, but in the process, I basically stopped moving. I would be sitting for 18 hours a day if between school and playing video games and just being on my computer. And a bunch of different family situations would exacerbate the whole problem. Eventually, I got up to 230 pounds by when I was like 15. So I would say that's like the climax of my downward spiral. And when I got there, kind of stayed there for a while until I realized, wait, this is not, nobody's gonna get me out of here, right? It's not gonna change unless I do something about it. Um, Eventually, I got into yoga, into breathwork, and I went at it for about 3 years until eventually I broke my back in a dive into a river. So we climbed up like a 30, 40 foot cliff to dive into this little pool that the river has. And tons of people do it all the time. Nothing happens. As I'm jumping, I let all my air out in a scream and I just tense up and I land right on my coccyx. So I had a compression fracture, T12, and then everything else was just fucked in the process. And that's kind of what led me towards the movement side of things. Like, wait, this is not diet, this is not breathwork, this is not meditation. Like, fuck, okay, I got to do something a lot more structural here. And then that got me here. So in the process, went through mobility, went through GOTA, and then eventually movement. Most important though in the process, and part of what got me to gravitate towards movement was this intersection between movement and I guess the energetic side of things, the somatic side of things, however you want to term it. Because all that I carried from 18 years of not moving at all wasn't just gonna be remedied by anything strictly movement or strictly breathing or any one of these things. So I appreciate movement in that it is kind of this intersection of all these things.
And when
To
you
that
would
effect, if I can just interject for a sec, before Ben posts another question, take it off track for a second. I was thinking, with your experience having gone through what I would equate to a very compromised environment. Not to say yoga's bad, not to say breathwork's bad, all of which are things that I advise people to do if they want to do. Just to the effect of like the Foo-Foo, like when you presuppose that the want to do something or the inference that there's an availability for that thing by doing the exercise that brings you into that space, you're welcoming in all those vibes. Do you feel like there's a significant difference in, because reason why I ask this is because people contextualize the neurology as being somewhat Foo-Foo, somewhat not available, not tangible. And I would consider that to be something more akin to an environment you're more familiar with, breath work, with the yoga. So how would you contextualize the difference between how people might see yoga being a little bit too feeling oriented and MovMed being too feeling oriented?
It's a conversation I've had with plenty of people who've gravitated towards this Foo-Foo space and then eventually landed on MovMed as well, where the way most of us and most of the people that I've had this conversation with that have done MovMed for any relative amount of time, what most of us arrive at is that, hold up, all these things that we've been feeling out only, we've only been feeling them out and we've been conceptualizing them, visualizing them, and just trying to, grasp at straws through yoga and breathwork. Here's movement, and it's giving us a way more tangible map to arrive at these sensations or these points or these centers that we are looking for in this Foo-Foo space, right? In that, because of that, I would say the difference is the way to get to these centers or these sensations is a lot more well defined because it's grounded in something that's a lot more I guess both broad and also specific. It's broad in the sense that it encompasses more aspects of the human experience. So it's not just how does your breath work or how does your brain conceptualize your body or your energy centers or whatever. It's more encompassing of the neurology and of how all these systems want to have coherence so that you can't really just go one way or the other. You have to kind of bring all of them together. And it's also more specific in the sense that it's addressing all these blind spots or these locks, these knots. That's how this Foo-Foo space would consider it. It's addressing these knots in a much more tangible way that's considerate, that is considering the deficits that most people would have in these sort of important areas, these energy centers and whatnot. So I would say there is and there isn't a difference. I would say it's aiming towards the same overall goal, and it's finding better results towards those goals because of the specificity in applying them and in trying to get to those goals. And in the end, what you get is a much more complete map of yourself because of it, because it's not leaving behind this very important thing that is just as important as the feeling and as the sensing and the visualizing, right?
So if I could synopsize that real quick, just to check if I heard that correct. We're more broad to the effect of being able to give you a, say it's like a biomechanical model, a physical model with some degree of breath work, movement, tangibles that most trainers are going to be looking into, maybe one avenue, maybe several. But you're saying our broad picture biomechanically was more sound with respect to what you've experienced. And then following the broad, we were more specific in the targeting of what emotional expressions, or rather maybe how reactivity in the nervous system could be so deeply ingrained in our personal behaviors that we may start to prescribe, oh, this is who I am versus how I'm experiencing myself right now. Which is largely helping people choreograph what is emotion versus what is neurological instability or dysregulation that they might be having an emotional reaction to.
Yeah,
was that
yeah, that's accurate 100%. I'd add that I'd want to kind of give this way of looking at both yoga and breathwork and all these things without this neurological aspect behind them would categorize most of their lived experience as something purely emotional, and thus you need to work on your emotions and you need to deal with your emotional bodies and your mind bodies and all these things. Whereas MovMed would say the emotions are arising as a result of the state that you find yourself in from a more encompassing lens, right? And then as you work on this kind of tip of the iceberg that is your emotions, in a sense, starts changing without you having to look to the emotions as the root of them.
Right. It could very well be just the brain having a tantrum about not being super clear on what's the motive or the goal of the environment, and because communication isn't available, or because some degree of I guess instructions are not present, there's a degree of reaction, or how do I engage prior to checking the boxes and figuring out what engagement is necessary. Essentially like kid brain in adult body.
Yeah, definitely tantrum is the word for sure. But you're on the other side of the tantrum because you're living it.
All right. That's
Yeah, I'm
it.
gonna ask, like, with kind of that the Foo-Foo background, what elements of that do you feel like have kind of stood the test of time, that were felt like they were kind of complementary to what we were doing with MovMed, or just any of the more like physical processes? Is what what elements are there that you think maybe somebody who's like strictly biomechanical could utilize in their practice to get more out of just the entirety of their self recovery practice?
I'd say so. When I look at this whole energetic Foo-Foo space, I to better understand it, I would divide it between the the people who are seeking enlightenment from a body-based path, and then the people who are seeking it from a sort of emotional and mental almost path. And there's a bunch of other, sub paths there. But if we're looking at the ones who do it through the body, it helps what they bring to the table that I think would be useful for most people over here, is as a result of their practice, they end up with a much more open mind to sensations. So one reason that I feel I'm able to grasp certain sensations, not necessarily faster, but I guess with more nuance in terms of how I can interpret it, is because of how much time I spent in developing an ability to, I guess, be open, be allowant to new sensations that weren't already part of my experience. And that's something where I look at people who are mainly focused on this biomechanical aspect, like, well, no, that's not how this works, or that's not how this works, or no, I need attention like this. And it's like, well, you don't know if that's the way it's supposed to work, and you don't know if that's how it feels. And unless you give a little bit of slack to whether or not something can feel differently, you're gonna stay stuck within this framework that you're in of movement and of breathing or whatever, perceiving. And you need different ones if you want to arrive at a different point. Can't build from where you're at, right? On the emotional spectrum, movement gives us a framework to map our emotions relative to our body and to our neurology. So instead of looking at the emotions as the reason our body is reacting the way it's reacting, or at least not only looking at it in this way, it gives us a little bit of slack for us to say, hey, emotions are coming up, but I'm aware that I'm safe in this environment, so I don't need to run away from them, and I also can understand them as part of this environment, of this system, so I can relate to them differently. Which is something that's I would say it's very parallel to the way yoga and spirituality approaches emotions, but it's not lacking this aspect of how can we relate it to how this thing functions from a survival perspective, right? Which is the place from which a lot of these behaviors come from in the first place, right?
So I want to clarify, because I think you do have a good perspective here, but maybe it was a little bit lost in my listening there. If you were to qualify the biomechanical model as being someone that comes from a camp that you perhaps go to, which you participated in, FP, WEC, Flowbility, RPR, I get similar, but not quite. That's more neuro. I meant
PRI.
Yeah, PRI. Thank you. So if you're looking at biomechanical models that inherently look at there being like this must be the case, and we're looking at a general overture of how we're expecting to see the baseline of humankind, I suppose it's very hard for people to see a correlative between why would emotions have any play or interplay with what you're looking at in a like a biomechanical model. It doesn't matter how the person feels as much as it matters how their physical body feels. And that distinction, that underlying like disassociation, which I see yoga or the Foo-Foo taking too much of the emotion and separating it from the physical, kind of like garnering as much of their physical effort to be like, ooh, and you're like, okay, you're making me uncomfortable. Like if you were to look at like their breathing patterns and just fundamentally how that, if you were to choreograph that around a baby, that baby's not learning like structural bracing. That baby's not learning how to like lift their head up. That baby's learning how to be dynamic before their stability. So if we're just looking at modeling behaviors, I think one of the main things that allows, which you were saying earlier, the ability to be allowant. And I heard you looking for the word, and I was hoping you'd say it, but we're looking for things all the time. We're never really listening for or allowing for. And if you qualify the facial nerves, right? Priority facial nerves, we think, are ones that have us giving us the ability to like speak or look or whatever. But oftentimes these are more expressive. The things that I would say are more important are ones that interconnect, like trigeminal nerve, which connects a number of different structures, but predominantly connecting how your eyes, your mouth, and the movement of these structures play into back here. And if you have a reference point for how everything connects as opposed to how everything focuses, like not giving all your attention to the effort, but how everything can resolve itself around a singular balanced, or in Goto words, the gyroscope, right? Your inner gyroscope is not your eyes. Your ability to listen is so connected with your ability to perceive space, depth, to perceive level. If we just connect back to our ears a little bit better, our vagus nerve, or the thing that allows for us to connect mind and body, or mind and heart, literally the thing that listens to our heart, the thing that listens to our organs, becomes that much more prioritized, because we're not disassociating our intention from what's really going on. You can always want for something. You can always look for what the next thing is. You can always look for what you can do to achieve this or that or this or that. But if you don't know where you are in space in this moment, if you can't listen to the things going on, the signals that are firing up from your organs through your neck into your ear area, and that relative signaling correspondently, I guess, configuring around, okay, so we're vestibularly settled like this, the organs are like this, so we have some kind of awareness of where we are twisted in space. If there's no coherence between that mind-body connection, the only thing you're hearing is the screaming of those signals without knowing where they're coming from. And so we may be guarding and limiting the access and the sensitivity, so thereby some other structures like our arms or legs get confused because our organs are all of a sudden guarding, just because there's some limitation in our teeth, or some limitation in our neck, some limitation in our intercostals. And all to the effect of, I wanted to do something, or I wanted to feel something, and I wasn't listening to where I was or how I felt, or even if I did feel in that moment prior to doing the thing I wanted to do. My point in all that, if I can synopsize, I think the model that you come from sees a lot of the feeling as priority, but it disassociates the feeling as being a thinking, like not really thinking, but rather a reflexive input. So an unconscious entrance into the brain from the body. And if we're always prescribing what it means to feel a certain way, then we're always allowing for ourselves to be in a body state that doesn't really coincidentally manage how we want to feel emotionally or expressively, or whatever. I feel like I just got distracted again from that topic. Your model, do you see that the biomechanics versus the sensory mechanics versus the feeling awareness are all aspects of the same sensory mechanics that we deliver? And in part, people are just focusing on the thing that makes the most sense to their brain or their stress state or their life experience, instead of becoming a little bit more triangular or three-dimensional and getting all those points to work together in a coherent fashion and seeing what it says about their personality.
I from hearing you, I think something really relevant that came was a phrase you'll hear every fucking day in that whole space is you are not your body, you are not your mind, you are not your emotions, right? And so here you in that phrase you get this lens of how they perceive themselves and their lived experience. Great, you can create some distinction between the things that you're living, so that in case any of them are like, you know, on fire, you can create a little bit of space and you can take a break and you can instead of react, you can be a little more proactive. Beautiful. But in that lens, you're creating this distinction. So when you go and look at your feelings, you look at your feelings, you're not looking at your body. And when you go and look at your body, you're not looking at the other ones. And when you go and look at your thoughts, well, that's not you. So they have nothing to do with the rest of them, right? And it doesn't make sense. And it creates the same havoc in your head when you're living in this sort of way where you have, and I say this from lived experience, you have zero idea of what's going on and why it's happening and how it connects to the rest of your experience and what it might have to do with, and let alone anything at all about your environment or the people around you. You're in your head, but it's not your head because it's not your thoughts, and it's this sort of super hazy space. Whereas, and I'm not, and I would kind of copy paste the same perspective to anybody in the biomechanics world because they look at their movement in the same way, right? They conceptualize their movement in the same way.
All the isolated behaviors.
So then you get all these people who are like, including, you know, this is where I was like, oh, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. I don't know. All of a sudden, okay, well, maybe that's going on. And it's not separate. And it's not this thing versus this thing versus this thing. And they're all part of me. And I can embrace all of them and then maybe even do something about them. And it's a huge sigh of relief because you get away from this incessant need to categorize and understand, and instead you just let it happen, which is funnily enough something that's often quoted and toted around in that whole space. Just let it happen, let the clouds pass by. But you can't do that if you're always like, what's going on towards one or the other, right?
It sounds like the same neuroticism you're describing, like between the emotional satisfaction versus the physical satisfaction. It's always seeking that dopamine that they register as being the most important.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're just looking at it from, and genuinely, neurology is essentially simpatico or the same as Eastern energetics. It's just modeled in a modern lens with considerations of certain degrees of medicine or certain degrees of modern mapping of maybe the brain, maybe the actual electrical translation of things, something that was modeled very differently with a very Eastern lens tradition, or in their traditional sense. I don't even know how to describe meridians and the like. So it's demonized because it's not easy to language in the same way. Similarly, when people get fixated into their isolated behaviors, whether it be I'm in an emotional setting or a enlightenment setting with yoga or breath work, or if I'm in a biomechanical setting where I'm analytical and I'm trying to get distinctive results with a clear directive at the end of it, both and are neglecting the opposite or their counterpart. So like if you're an athlete that doesn't consider maybe the injuries you're having are because of all the things that are happening in your life, they're just diminishing how much recovery you have, whatever. Those are oftentimes, we call them stress, but there's no such thing as not having a personal opinion about things happening in your life. So everything does come with an emotional tag on it. I think it's hugely important that more often than not, people in these spaces come to terms with the fact that it's the same neurosis when you're looking for answers without finding out where you are in space to begin with. So, like the expression I like to explain a lot of this with is the being the weakest chain in the link doesn't determine that there is a weak point that you have to fix. It determines that there is a chain that has deficits. And until such time as you learn how to like evenly disperse the mechanical load or the focus of operation, the deficit's going to keep coming back no matter how many times you fix or like target that one chain. You have to see how the behaviors interact. And behaviors interacting come from, we're not the most evolved species on the planet for no reason. Like, we have so much complexity, and people garner it as if it's their personality, but at the end of the day, it's becoming psychosis made popularized. Like, your outfit used to be the thing, but now it's the amount of like neurodivergent qualities you can put on your vest, like it's a TGI Fridays, and we're all mentally ill people just saying, I hate myself. How much do you hate yourself? Awesome. This is not a smile. I'm crying inside.
Hugo, in the spirit of kind of that whole idea of like the chains and finding deficits along them, obviously something you've worked with a lot is like the respiratory chain, the breathing. And I'm curious, kind of in the lens of what we've talked about, how you kind of just would describe your connection with the breath at this point, and how it's kind of evolved. And then in concert with that, kind of, you know, maybe the beginners, like what should everybody know about breathing? Like what is like baseline 101? Like, you should probably know about this. So kind of like what has it been to you? How has that evolved? And then what along with that is kind of the simple takeaways that most people should know in your mind.
So I want to give a little bit of backdrop, because even before I became sedentary and before I fell into depression, obesity, etc., I had asthma from when I was about 2 or 3 years old. Asthma and digestive issues. That kicked it off, right? And with that came to a degree this fear of heightened degrees of activity, but eventually that devolved into, you know, through sedentarism and lack of exercise, et cetera, continually dysfunctional breathing patterns led it to become, shit, dude, I'm going up a flight of stairs and I'm gassed and this sucks, right? So before I was able to conceptualize breathing as this sort of the engine that it is for our ability to move and think and live, when I first started looking at the breath and how to improve it, it was through Wim Hof, right? And so this super sympathetic approach, let's just huff and puff as much as we can and then hold for as long as possible and get some fireworks in your head going, and then eventually holotropic and all these other modalities, kind of piggybacking off this sensation of like, let's create more sensation instead of let's address what's going on at a baseline, right? So that's a little bit of the backdrop. My first foray into breathwork was, how can we feel more cool things and see more spirals and get more visuals? And that kind of ties all into the whole psychedelic space that I came from beforehand, which is like, let's just feel more, instead of, I'm feeling this, let me settle into it, let's see what we can do. Actually, let's see what's actually going on, right? From that, I'd eventually get into OA, because I'd been doing breathwork for a long ass time and nothing was working, nothing was improving. Out of all the things I was doing, I was still super fucking tired. Every time I was not sleeping good, I was still getting gas while going up a flight of stairs. So I'm like, okay, something's up there, something's got to change. And eventually hyper focusing on how does my respiratory rate and how does gas exchange and all of these things, how do they work in me, and how do they work in a dysfunctional breather, and how can we address them? And that's eventually what led me to MovMed, led me to meet Eric, and then eventually through Eric led me to meet MovMed, because I'm like, okay, wait, I can't only focus on rate and volume if my lung capacity is 100% fucked. because of my structure and the way I'm holding myself, right?
So real quick, I think you skipped over one. You had also done another after Wim Hof. You had done oxygen advantage.
Yeah, that's the foray into gas exchange, rate and volume, and how all these things affect my ability to move and I guess retain an aspect of balance in the face of effort, right? So that's, from this foray into the woo-woo aspect of breathwork to oxygen advantage, and then okay, oxygen advantage doesn't really address the mechanical side of these things. How can I improve my ability to stack? Because if I don't, my lung capacity is fucked. Everything in terms of rib cage is fucked. So what do I do now? And that's eventually what leads me here. In that process, particularly in the last two, oxygen advantage and MovMed, is where in between these two is where my practice lies. And based on that, I can say the most important things for any person to know about breathing is there's chemical and there's mechanical, and the two are one and the same. But if you're looking at mechanical, or rather, if you're looking at chemical and you're saying, okay, this is what I need to work on. I need to work on my rate and volume. I need to work on how I'm exchanging gases. I need to work on nitric oxide. I need to improve my Bolt score. I need to improve my breath hold times. I need to breathe slower. You can't get any of these things in check until the mechanical is addressed to some degree. And so I would say if I were to create a ladder of importance, number one in my view now is those mechanics. There's no good breathing on a rib cage that can't move. And again, this falls into this whole space that just categorizes belly breathing as good and as diaphragmatic, and it says screw everything else that's happening in the body and screw everything that's happening at the rib cage. That doesn't need to move. Let's just get the belly moving. Which is where I came from in this Wim Hof and all these breathwork spaces. Address the mechanics of the rib cage, find growth out of the rib cage, and not only will you see benefits in terms of breathing, in terms of how you are able to create effort without getting gassed, but you'll see benefits in terms of how everything else moves, because it's all on this everything up above your rib cage lies atop your rib cage, and everything is to one degree or another, it's dependent on the rib cage moving well, and then everything below it just as much. You can't create good pressures without it. And then important on the chemical side is, well, the chemical side is gonna have a feedback loop into the mechanical side. And so here is where I would create a physiological connection to the neurology of our system between breathing and neurology. That respiratory rate, that gas exchange is super important to keep us out of the sort of in and up response, this sort of contraction as a result of any stress that we come into, because if our respiratory cycle is keeping us in stress, then we need to address it to some degree or another if we want any lasting changes in terms of the mechanics of our body. And so that's what I conceptualize as important in terms of the chemistry, is just undo the fact that your respiratory cycle might be keeping you in stress, so that then you can look at the mechanics and say, how can I establish a baseline here that keeps me out of stress in the long run? And on the chemical side, that looks like, consider your volume, how much you're breathing, so how hard you're breathing in terms of how audible it is. Consider how fast you're breathing, so how many breaths per minute. Consider your ability to exhale. I know there's a lot of camps that hyper focus on creating a good exhale, but good exhale comes with a good inhale, and so that's both chemical and mechanical. And I guess this is as much of an assertion as a question. The importance of nitric oxide is super relevant in terms of keeping airways open as well as keeping circulation going. So that is an aspect that I look at a lot in terms of the chemistry and mechanics being most important. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Do you think that there's an associative relationship between people who are too exhalative and people who have that limited, as you were saying before, that ability to articulate the ribs, articulate the structures without it so much being an isolative behavior, but it being something that's coincidental along the spine? Do you find that in the camps that perhaps over focus on bolt score or over focus on trying to tighten the ribs with an exhale, do you feel like there's a limitation that they're building themselves into, or do you feel the opposite?
I do. I do think there is, and it's always super interesting because there's different there's always exceptions. So you can't really create a blanket statement towards any of the two. But in a lot of the people that I've worked with, in myself and people I know of, exhale holds and exhales, or at least camps that create a lot of emphasis on these qualities, I see in them behaviors that are almost like jumping the gun really, really often. Like, they're always amped up, and they're really quick to try to find a solution, really quick to try to get to the end. In a sense, I see the behavior that the input that they're giving themselves constantly through exhaling and through holding and through exhaling and through holding, is always about trying to get to the end of this shitty sensation that I'm feeling. I'm trying to get out of this exhale hold. Maybe I'm trying to make it last longer in the long run, but in the moment when I'm in it, all I'm thinking is I want to get the fuck out of here. This sucks, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks. And you can conceptualize that as many ways you want to, like, yeah, this is gonna make me feel better in the long run. And I use them. I use exhale holds and I use forceful exhales sometimes. But if that's the core of your practice, no matter how you conceptualize it, you're gonna be thinking, I want to get the fuck out of here right now. And this sucks, this sucks, this sucks. And I still don't have language to explain any of this, I guess physiologically, but in my felt experience, this is like, I'm getting tinier, I'm getting tighter, I'm getting smaller, versus what I see in free divers, for example, inhale holds, and what I see in my felt experience doing both static and dynamic apneas, and also in people who are training slower respiratory rates with higher efforts. It's just a lot more laid back. It might suck a little bit, but honestly, I'm not so focused on getting a result so fast that I have to submit myself to something so horrible all the time. I can inhale and I'll be okay. And I can still get adaptations. And in fact, I need to, because if I want to dive for longer, then I gotta inhale a pretty big breath. Or if I want to work at higher capacities for longer, then my inhale doesn't need to be small. It doesn't need to be light. It doesn't need to be, this ratio doesn't need to be exact. I can play with, hell, I can play with mouth breathing, and it won't kill me, right? That's the behavior that I associate between the two. Is I tend to see people who are jumping the gun in terms of on the exhale side, and then people who are on the inhale side, it's just an ability to relax, akin to a free diver and I present free divers as like the epitome of people who are on the inhale side. It's their ability to stay calm under literal pressure, like 3 times atmospheric pressure, right? So, yeah.
So just real quick, you were saying you're having a little bit of trouble communicating this to some people, the relationship between that inhale, exhale, and that nature to maybe like rush the process in that exhale, or to allow some range or space in that inhale. This is going to be maybe the simplest, maybe not, depending on how people like how I say these. But traditionally, when we're talking what midline is, when we always say midline in MovMed, if you thought about your heart, it being like a softball, center of your chest for the most part, and there being an elevator shaft that your heart could travel all the way up to your head, through your neck, all the way down through your diaphragm, through your belly, into your pelvic floor. Essentially, that same width that travels all the way, that cylinder is equivocable, give or take. And so our perception of that that middle elevator with our organs innervated along our spine, with all the attachments of where our spine might feel like it's going because certain things that are attached to it are moving or not moving. That's what the midline is. So the things we can't see, but the things we're connected to that are of importance for us to be able to, if we need to minimize spinal motion, those things need to be sound, not necessarily compromised, in which is in many cases the situation for many of us. And at the end of the day, if we have a habit of, because you can see the front line's way more open, it's less skeletal, it's more interactive, like you have more dimensions, particularly because the shoulder allows for a lot of the rib motion into an open pelvis, as opposed to on the back side, our pelvis is closed. Our ribs aren't nearly as articulate due to not having a thumb on the back of our hand or a head that articulates to that full range of motion on that back side. So effectively, this range of motion in the front is our largest access point to movement, or our perceived movement, because of how motile it is. And motile being different than mobility in that I can move into different positions, but if I'm moving to those different positions while taking away oxygen supply or natural reflex down the midline, more often than not, I'm replacing motility for external or extrinsic mobility. And we want to have both. So the midline is largely the organs, all the innervation from the stuff that's free floating or the stuff that's very fascially dependent, and it's not structured as much on the ribs or the pelvis. It's more spinal. And because of the nature of all this stuff oftentimes being pushed out of stack, it pulls the spine forward or pushes the spine forward. And as a byproduct, by pushing the spine forward or pulling the spine forward, we're effectively creating a flexive nature on the front side of our body, or the midline, the most interactive part of our body. And it could very well be putting some vertebrae into extension, but regardless of what's happening at isolated vertebrae, the tissue we're most aware of is becoming flexed and fixed. So the way I see it, the way I argue like why it's so important to create that inhale is because it naturally invigorates or creates that extensive pattern, because we need to undo a lot of the gut smashing or the stomach smashing that we have as a byproduct of all of our grumpy posture.
So are you saying, all right, so here's the midline, it's all these very important structures that are supposed to have certain degrees of motility that we take away because of our lifestyle, and relative what the natural conjecture that I make is exhale holds, exhale centric efforts, because of the way exhales work, compress all of that in a very similar fashion that this does, and living in this
flexion, a pathology of flexion throughout the system. So the swallow that should be a little bit more able to swallow from up here is diminished in your thorax because there's not enough pressure pushing your head up, is by nature diminished. You can't have something big while there's something atop it that introduces pressure to the system not being full. Like the micro of the face is there's macros, like the thorax and the nose are so similar. If you don't have that maxilla lift or pressure, you can see oftentimes it's the same thoracic pressure that's missing. And the vectors may be different just because the neurology plays with all this like flipping of mapping and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, the idea is we trust our system through the midline predominantly to figure out what it's doing. I can use my homunculus, or the things that are more consciously aware, to articulate and maneuver, but the goal being that I want to have enough fuel, I want to have enough energy supply and like mood reserve, so to speak. Like I can sustain happy energy, happy motivated focus for extended period of time. I'm not just like buckling down, 8th cup of coffee, my butt is like pinching in like the loudest waterfall into the toilet ever, and we're just trying to figure out how to get through these like horrific, almost acid burning hiccups. And at the end of the day, most people are just talking about like, okay, if this is stuck and there's all this mucus and there's all this congestion and there's no and it's free oxygen and there's no actual like oxygen saturation to open things up, then how do we figure out how to create the space that you're looking to fill? Like how do you know you're filling in the space you could take up and you're not just like conforming your jigsaw into smaller spaces until everything's gone?
And thus you can see exhale holds as something that counteractive to finding more space within you and more so taking it away.
Yeah, it'll elicit more control, it'll elicit more flexion, but inherently if you're not bracing against your own intrinsic pressure reserves, you're bracing against your own tensions, or you're tensioning against your own structure, which is inhibiting your own lungs, thereby reducing your next inhale. So like if we don't find out what baseline is from the inhale, if we don't figure out how to breathe to fullness, we'll never know what extension is, and we'll always be fighting the structural elements that may be stuck in extension while we're still biomechanically only able to leverage from a what feels like flex position. Because if you think about everyone doing their thing, unless it's an athlete that's done it over and over and over, whenever you're doing something, if you're setting up, doesn't matter what it is, you're probably pre-tensioning. You're probably like readying your body up in the ways that you know how to do. And some people do their funky, silly stuff, and some people do like their like ankle stuff, and they're like, yeah, these ankles, yeah, look at me. And at the end of the day, everyone's creating their map moment by moment, proprioceptively, and they're demanding more of it because their adrenal response isn't at the same time up-regulating coherence. It's up-regulating the amount of okay, if we're flexed here, we're guarding here for no reason, or is there a reason? How do we get out of that? Oh, we're not going to get out of that. We're gonna buckle down and we're gonna really commit to doing this. Okay, all right, you're in charge.
I laugh because it's an experience I know well. And it wasn't until movement that I was able to conceptualize it in the sense of like, okay, well, what the fuck? Why is this happening? After I broke my back, I remember the first time we had a session, I would get huge spasm throughout my back. And it's, debilitating. Like I can't move. There's a spasm in my back. That's all that's going on. It's just like, a fucking like calf spasm, but throughout the whole back. And I sat on the plyo ball in the diaphragm for a while, and when I went to get out of the position, I felt like an old man, right? I'm like, oh fuck, no, don't spasm, don't spasm, don't spasm. But it was really interesting because it gave me this lens to understand those spasms in a way of like, okay, well, this is an odd position that I haven't been in. My body doesn't understand it at all, and I'm not able to relate to it in any coherent way that I know of, that it knows of. So it's just grasping, right? And throughout this process, what it's done is exactly that. It's opened up this ability to physically open up in relation to an input instead of closing down, and therefore opened up more freedom in terms of, oh, I can do this. I don't have to. My body won't spasm in the face of this because it has the ability to relate to it differently. And to connect it to breathing, I guess it's why I'm moving away from this exhale centric practice, because among other reasons, it it just closes you in, both literally and figuratively closes you into this only and one and only option of bracing and tightening and closing to relate to an input, instead of there's probably a million different ways I can relate to it, and they're all probably good. I just need to find the one that I want right now, right?
Yeah, if you look at chemically, oxygen is a wildly chaotic experience relative an exhale. So if you're inhaling, it's interbulating a ton of your already inflamed or undersaturated environments. So it's like increased perception is why most people get startled by their own inhale, or they speed up because there's so much more stimulus that they're starting to perceive. It just makes it seem like, because they're used to not waiting for that perception to build and like stay calm through it, they're used to only experiencing that when they're doing something hard, fast, or effortful. And yeah, helps to be overstimulated to start. So you know what it's like. It's possible to be overstimulated without there having to be anything going on.
Yeah, I remember one of the last sessions we had during the cert. Uh, I was able to just get a lot of effort out of my intensity out of my system. And I remember saying like, oh, this is what I feel like when I'm angry. Like this is what I feel like when I'm pissed off and I want to murder somebody. But now it's a normal. Like this is okay. I can feel like this. I can embody this without it feeling like I'm gonna murder somebody. All right, cool.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're a human being, that's a possible experience. You're gonna feel for whatever reason, and it may be so nonsensical, and it has nothing to do with the person doing the thing. And when you really think about it, you're like, I don't want to hurt anyone. What am I thinking right now? But the affect of having those experiences are you being truthful with yourself, that you're willing to explore your own volatility, and you're not going to run away from it because you yourself aren't scared of it. If you yourself are scared of your own volatility, that's something to be scared of. And you should put a
Oh
sign
yeah.
on your forehead, be like, I don't deal with my own issues. They're your problem. And we can kind of pick up on that, but because it's becoming the norm, we're kind of just like letting crazy people into our car, into our bed, into our lives, and then making children with them. And we're like, oh, no wonder this kid is neurodivergent. No, no. He's a third generation mouth breather that like bites his own head off.
Yeah, that's a nice tie into the emotional aspect we were talking about earlier, and being able to essentially funnel the energetic component of that emotion into a productive task. In that case, it was whatever exercise you're doing in that moment, Hugo. I wanted to ask too, like when you get to that extent of the inhale, when you feel at your biggest, and inevitably you need to exhale, how do you kind of think about or maybe help people retain that size, not necessarily just go back into okay flexive, you're not obviously not trying to push air out quickly, but kind of how do you think about maintaining that sense of openness even as you exhale, as you inevitably need to?
Um, because of where I come from and where I'm moving away from, I'm I'm very adamant on playing the long run in terms of all this stuff because so much of my body was on like non-existent in terms of contractile ability that I I guess I've just learned to identify and play the long run in with people who are unable to retain size in the face of an exhale. So it usually takes 3, 4 sessions before I encourage anybody to try and retain size in any meaningful way. Um, because I really I since I come from like, oh, this whole chunk of my body's dead and I can see it in other people, I'm like, okay, well, let's just build up sensation locally here and then eventually stack it on top. And I appreciate the way you guys set up the cert because it lended itself really well for that. Um, once I notice, okay, here's somebody who can coordinate more and who can, I guess, help themselves in the process of staying big. Um, I look to disassociate the exhale from any sort of compression abdominally. We have these super mobile, hypermobile abdomens that are just breathing for us instead of the ribcage. And so I'm looking to kind of find a baseline for that abdomen, not stiff, but just not so distended that it's the thing that's breathing for us. And the moment that happens, people tend to start feeling their breath start going into their thorax a little more. Um, and then the moment we can start managing pressures differently, getting pressure to move downwards and outwards, um, then it's a little easier to say, hey, just don't let the rib cage dump so much. Just and they can grok it, right? It's like, okay, just exhale, but don't fall. And all of a sudden, since they've been mapping their back differently, since they've been mapping their armpits differently, um, since they have pressures, they are helping them. I can be here and then I don't have to out. I can just be here upright and use my ribs actually to exhale. I can use my diaphragm, I can let my diaphragm come up without having to crunch down, looking for some sort of stability, some sort of stacking that I'm not finding, right?
In that question, I heard just real quick uh, I suppose it may be something that you said, but I didn't hear. Did you have any tooling, like, so with the idea of being able to disassociate, say, like the belly breath or belly tensions from the exhale? Is there a mechanism or a reflex or a tooling thing that, like, you pull out of your Batman tool belt? You're like, we're not trying to get all the pressure. We're not trying to do anything severe here. But what is, like, is there a tool that you use to be able to get someone to, in the moment, you're like, here's something you can do right now. We'll see how you respond to it. But it's something you can do before an exhale, or
Most valuable has most valuable has been self-touch, self-massage, um, in terms of being able to map and literally push into if someone's like completely dead in the abdomen, they can't retain any pressure, push into your abdomen and push it out. And that has helped tons in hey, here's a bracing. Here's something waking up. Oh, I can do that. I can brace through there. Bracing doesn't mean flexing my abs, right? It means something completely different. So that's been really useful. Um,
what about swallowing? Is that something that's easier or hard for most people?
Swallowing is actually it tends to be with the people I work with. One of the things that's a little longer takes a little longer for it to come into effect. And maybe that's just the way I present it, or maybe it's the people I'm working with, likely the way I'm presenting it. But it tends to be that the people I'm working with, when they're swallowing, it's like, oh, I can feel it down to here, right? Or I can feel it down to here. It doesn't necessarily um, extend itself to be the thing that helps someone stay big, right? Once I am able to guide them towards different pressures through the plyos and through touch and through deep pressure therapy, then the swallow becomes this thing. It has a path to go through that isn't collapsed, right? It has this thing to flow through, and there's sensation there instead of it being, oh, it gets stuck and I can't feel anything below my neck, because I don't feel anything below my neck, right? All of a sudden I feel something, and oh, this is what my swallow is doing when I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that the coordination of the swallow just has to become more full body as a whole. That's why we often have just purely suction based exercises just to completely kind of isolate that realm of pull essentially into the body to make swallowing something you can do with your back essentially. And if you can get that, and that's something where it is easier to teach. I often will teach it where I have a massage gun. I'm working it on their like thoracic vertebrae, and then I'm having them swallow and just trying to feel like, oh, you feel how the vibration quality kind of changes while you swallow, and then can you actually feel like the swallow kind of starts from this point that we have the gun? And that's a lot easier than like in an online space where you're not there and you can't go hands on. That's more difficult, but that's where like stuff like the plyo balls, or I don't know, maybe somebody can get like one of those massage balls and kind of like make that happen for themselves. But yeah, that skill, I think it can, regardless, like that pause and swallow between an inhale and an exhale at least makes people pause for a second, and like they have to at least hold the pressure for 2 seconds, and like that in of itself is hard enough. And then on their exhale, they're probably retaining a little bit more than they were before. But yeah, you're right that in order for it to be really something that you can concentrate pressure or concentrate tension that helps, uh, I guess, maintain the pressure through that swallow is something that comes along over a longer period of time for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to add that what you said reminded me of pausing and in between an inhale and an exhale. One thing that I focus on and in teaching any sort of changes to someone's breathing is the quality of being able to slow down the exhale. a really simple quality, but it's got a ton of depth to it. And when it comes to maintaining size, if you exhale too fast, there's no way you're gonna, at least initially, there's no way you're gonna hold any size if you're just done, right? Um, Especially if you're used to dumping size to exhale. So being able to make your rate and your volume slower and smaller, even though you're inhaling so big, um, is in one way or another training this ability of, okay, I'm really big and it all wants to fall, but I'm gonna try to hold it as I'm exhaling really slowly. I think that's one of the things that contributes to the people I work with getting to the point of, oh, I can maintain. It's not just um not purely mechanical, not purely something structural going on. It's something that, oh, I'm choosing to breathe slower so that I can retain the size in the process.
Yeah, imagine if you're pacing so fast for everything and there's no real threat around you, or if the environment isn't going as fast as you, then there's going to be a degree of your personality that's expecting or predisposed to being more ready or expecting other people to be more ready when there's nothing that has been communicated or clarified. And I think there's so many things, if we just start to attend to, if we're a little bit more ready to listen for, is that most of us are rhythmically inside so fast paced or so unsettled that we either don't listen and we correspondingly ignore a bunch of things that are like creating impulsive or reflexive action at a frequency that not only do we not monitor, but is affecting our heart rate, is affecting our breath, and is being a coverall to how we associate, okay, I'm in this mood, but why do I feel a little off? Why is sleep a little hard? Why is communicating a little hard? I feel like I would like to smile, but there's some things, maybe the nerves that are controlling some breathing components are making it hard for me to breathe, such that I can feel like I can go into a full unaffected smile and not feel like I need to take a breath all of a sudden. I think at the end of the day, most of us are just not super cognizant of the many things that we have bustling around in our disorganized hodgepodge of a brain library. And we think that we can go in and like pick up this, pick up that, but because at the first point of entry it was not organized, there's going to be no like a new association of like there's a guy in there tidying up. There's no janitorial staff in your brain being like, all right, you're not feeling good this week, but if you rest, I swear I'll get this all this shit cleaned up. You rest well enough, you rest and digest, dude. If you're digesting, oh, whoa, Nelly, we'll clean this guy up like nobody's business. No, that dude is you, and you don't want to do it in the first place. So that dude's on the computer playing video games and he's munching on some junk. Like they're the same correlative, unless you make the like decision to listen to where you're at, which is what you clearly did, and see where you wanted to go, or see where you were and how it may not have been bringing you where you wanted to go. You were like, okay, so if right now I'm not making it easy on myself, but I am making other things happen, and those things are correspondingly not making things easier on myself, perhaps they are in turn making things harder on me. And maybe if I did A, B, and C a little more regularly, I could still do this, but I could also have some real clarity on what it is that would get me to the point I want to go. A little self-sacrifice, so to speak, such that there's some clarity on what it is you've been so attached to, the mess in your head, the mess in your body, the mess in your whatever, your mess in your life. If you just listen a little bit, you'll start to see it's a mess. No one likes the mess. You don't like the mess. I don't like the mess. We could figure it out, but maybe just notice that it's a mess to start.
I guess one like little wrap up question for you, Hugo, is kind of like, you've obviously come a long way at this point. What's next? Like, what are you kind of trying to achieve personally at this point, whether that's from a more physical standpoint or just like overall things that you're trying to kind of make happen for yourself?
So that brought it back. And it was this conversation I had with someone who's been doing MovMed a couple months, or at least at the time of the conversation. And she had asked me, what are the things that you were doing that you're no longer doing as a result of or after having gone through the cert? and um, and I had already thought about it, but I hadn't been asked to express it in that way, and it made me realize like, oh shit, there's a ton of things that I was doing that were like a staple in there. I attributed like, oh, these are the things that I need to do to feel better, that I stopped doing because I didn't need to do them anymore. Being certain types of breath holding, being certain types of stretching, certain types of of positions that I thought were the thing I needed, just kind of disappeared. It's like, okay, well, this takes care of it, and so much more, right? Um, and I think there's a lot to be said about taking away more and just finding that specificity in terms of the thing that's going to help you actually get to where you want to go. Um, one of the things I said was like, okay, well, I'm finding progress in XYZ metric that I think, or that is supposed to be useful. But even though I'm finding progress in these, my life isn't any better. My life in terms of my levels of pain, or my ability to recover, my ability to perform, or my ability to think straight, sleep well, it's not improving. So, or if it is, it's minimal compared to doing these few things for a consistent amount of time, right? So yeah, that was the thought. And I think along the same line is my future goals is finding this to be something a lot more reflexive, a lot more settled into my daily life. Something that when I say this, I mean this sense of stability that doing movement consistently provides you is um, giving it as much time as I have, and more. Because frankly, right now I'm super short on time between all the things I'm doing. Being able to find the time, create the time for it to become something that's more settled into my experience, and that is more, I guess, overarching. Is kind of the foundation, so that the other physical pursuits or other pursuits in life that I'm pursuing, chasing, are not necessarily easier, but just less unnecessarily hard. I would say, from the background that a lot of us come from, or having had certain things happen in life, some things that would come easy to some people end up being way harder than they should be, um, which just makes certain people feel like they're having to make this insurmountable effort to get to things that some people are able to do very easily. Um, and I feel movement has, I guess, catapulted me forward in towards being normal, and being able to do the hard things with a little more ease, um, in all aspects of life, from vocalization, which I really appreciate the dive that you guys have taken into sound and singing and voice, to the dumbest things like fucking like solving puzzles and communicating with my partner or whatever it is, right? Um, so that's a huge part of it. Um, Personally, I'm looking forward to being able to meld movement and my own twist on breathing into a more comprehensive approach to training that um, encompasses everything I've gone through in terms of the biomechanical side of it, and making it super sustainable, super accessible, because there's a lot of solutions out there, but for 99% of people, they can't touch them, financially speaking. And I resonate with that a lot, because who doesn't, right? So finding more accessible ways, like the memberships that we're offering in MovMed, to make all this stuff just give it to more people, because more people can get a lot from it, right? And make it also just understandable, right? Not just, I think movement suffers from this thing of like, until you try, you don't get it. But I think that's how it's going to be forever. But there is always this, I guess, a little step forward that we can take in making it, I guess, a little bit more mentalized, so that some people can buy in without having to try it. Because 99% of people won't try it until they buy into it to some degree, right?
I agree with you. I think Eric's doing a really good job doing that.
Yeah.
And I think to the same effect, Ben, is doing a great job with what I'm giving him to work with at the present. But I am still holding back some of the, I guess, clearer explanations of things before we have tangibles wherein people can work with some products that are like A to Z, like this is how you do it, or this is how this thing may come up, instead of just giving this huge flurry of library information and being like, hey, fuck you. Hey, fuck you.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't get this? You don't get all of this? We made it, you don't get it? And being one of those guys. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think the 5 for 5 classes that Hugo is running for us, as well as a couple other coaches. And Hugo, your classes are 11 a.m. Pacific time, Saturdays in English and Sundays in Spanish, which is awesome that you're helping us bring it to another language. I imagine that process of translation has been kind of fascinating to try to put together. Is it almost different imagery that you end up using at times, or does it turn into kind of the same feeling thing?
No, it's different imagery. I mean, we're using similar words because some of it is relatively straightforward, but there is this cultural backdrop that Spanish speakers, and especially Hispanic people in the Americas, have, that I can pull on to make it, I guess, a little more vivid, where English for them might not give them that ability, right? It's I wouldn't, it hasn't necessarily, it was initially very difficult, like the first few weeks of just trying to conceptualize all this, but after working with some people in person, which has probably been my favorite experience of teaching movement so far, in Spanish, it's become more similar to the English process, which is like individualizing it to each person and how this person might respond better to XYZ input, XYZ cue. So after a point, it wasn't necessarily difficult in terms of translation. It was just, it's a completely different experience individualizing it to people of different cultures, because each person from each different Spanish speaking country lives a pretty much 99% a different lifestyle than me here in Puerto Rico compared to somebody from Argentina or etc. Right? So that's been really cool. I'm grateful to some of the clients I've had who've been really consistent. One from Spain, one from Argentina, one from Brazil, but living in like the Czech Republic, giving me like a bunch of different lens into, okay, well, we all speak the same language, but we all live completely different lives, and our experience of our body is different because of it. Which is really, it's mind blowing, always mind blowing. Yeah. And it looks like Sunday classes are going to be bilingual, so there's another English speaking class for anybody who's there. It's nice that a lot of people who are speaking Spanish also go both ways. So yeah, super nice.
Totally. Well, thanks for doing that, man, and thanks for coming on. It was nice to chat. Yeah, man, we'll be in touch.
Thank you for having me. Dude. Again, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it. I appreciate it a lot, and I'm excited for what's to come.
Likewise, happy to have you on the team. You're invaluable resource for us to be able to create. I think Spanish is also a more limbic language, so you're going to be creating something that has a way more vested demographic, like a more interested demographic than I think most people would find themselves being in English.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I see what you're saying, for sure. It's a lot more, it's more fluid, and it's a lot more onomatopoeic in a sense. It's a lot more sound based and movement based. And I love English. I appreciate English, but there is that difference in that English is very square almost in terms of its descriptions and how it communicates certain things, where English or Spanish is a lot more fluid.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Agreed. Cool, man. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Ben, for the better questions. My rants were a little bit of a distraction.
No, they always add. They always add, and they give me something to go off.
They always add. Yeah.
Definitely parts of them add.
If you can keep your ear open for as long as you need to, they always add.